Hey guys, it's Nikki here. I'm here today to do my Book of the Month review for Lost Roses by Martha Hall Kelly. This is a World War I/Russian Revolution historical fiction book. You follow largely three perspectives: Sophia, a Russian noble; Eliza, an American socialite who is Sophia's cousin; and finally Varinka, who is a Russian peasant. I was really excited to pick this book up because I'd read Martha Hall Kelly's first book, Lilac Girls, and adored it. I thought it did a really good job looking at the women's concentration camps, and it was just horrifying and just incredibly touching at the same time, and just very, very well written. And as I don't read as much World War I or Russian Revolution books, even though I do have an interest, I was really excited to pick this up because of that as well. So the plot, kind of as I summarized to you, you're following these three women through World War I and the Russian Revolution, and just kind of how their lives tie together and how they're interwoven through the course of the war, and just how their families are connected as well. The story is told from those 3 points of view, but because of this, the story is a little bit convoluted. It was a little bit harder to get into because the multiple perspectives going forward with kind of the rest of the historical situation made it really tricky for me to kind of always follow perspective switches in the beginning until you got used to the voices of the characters. So just a heads up there with the plot. Very well done is in terms of how all-encompassing the points of view were, but it made the story a little bit hard to follow at first, which leads me into the story progression. I think generally it was pretty good pacing, and the story itself was pretty straightforward. There weren't a lot of twists and turns. And it flips between perspectives that once you're used to the voices of each of the characters, I found it that nothing really didn't drag, nor was it too jumpy. I would get Sophia and Eliza mixed up at first because their voices sounded very similar. That made some of the context harder for me to pick up. It didn't impact the flow of the story overall, if that makes sense. Like, going chapter to chapter, the story progressed in a way that made sense, even if I wasn't always sure which character we were following in the immediate vicinity. The other thing that I just want noted is, like, each chapter, which was a single perspective, and at the end of each chapter, there would be some cliffhangers, just kind of, they try to make you excited to come back to the perspective. I found them really effective. I don't know that everybody will. Some people might find them really annoying, but I liked the way that it was done, and it did make me excited to come back to some of the perspectives, especially Sophia's perspective. In terms of the timeline of the story, I actually found that time moved pretty like seamlessly. You would leave somebody in a perspective to go to a new perspective, and when you came back to that first perspective, the appropriate amount of time had passed, and they do a little summary saying, like, oh, this is what they've been up to, and then you just pick up with them where they were at that point in time, where I'm doing a bad job of explaining this. So the timeline was constantly moving, and when you switch perspectives, you didn't jump backwards, you just kept going. I'm doing a bad job. I'm going to move forward. And now I'm going to touch on the characters. I didn't love them. I found them a little bit flat, personally. I did find Sophia and Eliza, at least at the beginning, to feel pretty samey in terms of their voice. Like I mentioned, I did have a hard time distinguishing between the two for the first little bit. Part of that is also because the first couple of chapters, they're together because they're cousins. And so they were in the same situation. So it took a second or two every time I switched perspectives to really, like, hone in on who it was. And while I think some people will really like the characters, I just didn't connect with them in a way that I think made the more emotionally impactful scenes impactful. So there was a few times where I could tell it was supposed to be like tugging at your heartstrings or a few tearjerker moments, but because I didn't really feel connected with the characters, like I just didn't have that sense of emotional tie to the scenes. I was a little sad that I didn't have that emotional tie because I think it would have made the book a lot more engaging had I had that connection, just because there was so much of that the emotional scenes. There were so many of them. So I didn't love the characters. They weren't bad, I didn't get emotionally attached. And with that kind of plot progression, body of the story stuff out of the way, I'm gonna just do a couple likes and dislikes just to give you some more ideas about whether or not this book would be for you. One thing I really liked was the women relationships. I loved the friendship that Sophia and Eliza shared. I loved the relationship between Luba and Sophia as well. It was so sweet, and the way the two sisters cared about each other was just very, very touching. And I also really enjoyed the relationship between Varenka and her mother. And like there's so much going on in everybody's lives that having these like really solid relationships for each woman just was really, really wonderful. I also, as mentioned, I actually really enjoyed the pacing. It didn't really drag, and the way the pacing mixed with how the timeline worked for the story, just in like how it moved, the entire story felt very smooth. Like I mentioned, the transitions weren't very jumpy, so I never really got pulled out due to a pacing issue. And now I'll just do a couple cons. One, I've already mentioned, the characters were kind of flat, and that removed a lot of the emotional impact of the story. There was a few specific scenes that I could tell were supposed to be tearjerker scenes, and it just didn't do it for me. And the other one is, again, just going back to how the multiple perspectives are used, and the way the two different historical situations, the Russian Revolution and World War I, that even though they're kind of tied together, the way they're talked about mixed with the perspectives just made it really convoluted. So I found the first little bit of the book very hard to follow. And so that might be something that's just something to keep in mind if you're looking at picking this book up. And that leads to my wrap-up. I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars because there were a lot of things I liked. I liked the female relationships, I liked the pacing, I liked the general idea of the story, I liked the settings, but there were a few things that just pulled me out of having an amazing experience with this book. The two cons that I mentioned were kind of the biggest issues I had with staying completely engaged and completely in love with the book. And I really enjoyed experiencing this point in history. As I mentioned, it is a slightly different time than I'm used to reading. I do a lot, and I mean a lot, of World War II historical fiction. And so branching out a little bit, going into the Russian Revolution, World War I, which I do kind of have a passing interest in, made this book all the more interesting to me in terms of that, and I did get a lot out of the historical context that was being displayed in the book. And I think that aspect, the author did really well, just bringing these historical situations to life. And now I'm going to jump to the 100% spoilery part here. If you guys aren't wanting to get more in-depth spoilers, I know I didn't do a really spoiler-free review, but like this part is definitely spoilery, so click off here if you're not interested, and I'll see you in the next video. Otherwise, here we go. For the book club questions, I'm starting with my usual, what was your initial first reaction? And my initial first reaction was actually a little bit of concern, because they do start off in America, but the very first chapter in Russia, there are some comments made that really made me very, very concerned for what kind of violence was going to be mentioned later on in the book. So while I did enjoy it, I was very worried about what was to come. Prompt 2, what is your favorite chapter or scene? My favorite scene by far is the one where Sofia and Luba reunite. Just the way they do it is super sweet, and just the way they react is in character, and it was so like warm, and oh, I loved it. It was a scene, as I made a note here, full of love and later daring. Question 3, how did the characters change throughout the story? They did grow. I would even argue that they became a lot more jaded and cynical because a lot of their growth was due to war and traumatic circumstances. And the biggest growth they had was just kind of their loss of innocence, and in some cases ignorance as well. Especially with Sofia and her sister. They were a little sheltered. 4, how did you like the ending? The ending was alright. It was no great surprise. It was as clean and tidy and cute as I expected. 5, would you read more by this author? I 100% would, especially if she writes some books that are in a slightly different historical time period than this even. I think she does a really good job bringing the time periods to life, so I'd like to see what she does with a situation I'm less familiar with. And 6, what books or book does this book remind you of? And this book, really, it reminds me of the first book she read, Lilac Girls. So you guys will, anybody who picks up the 2 books will notice immediately the crossover. They both follow continental European women and an American socialite, and the American socialite trying to help these women. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just very, very similar. So if you've read one, you'll probably enjoy the other. So otherwise, I can't really think of anything. There's a lot of other books that feels that while their stories are similar, they have a very different vibe, so I can't necessarily say that if you enjoyed one, you'd enjoy the other. So I don't really have any other recommendations here. And that is the end of this video. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I had a lot of fun reading this book and actually writing the review for this one. Really figuring out what to say and what to leave out was really interesting this time around. And with that, I will leave you here, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.